Ah, Headmaster, I trust you flogged that young man within an inch of his life.
Ready when you are.
Diomedes Daring, Decrepit Dotards, and the Dewey Decimal, all in this delayed departure for the 34th I'll Explain Later, the Doctor Who podcast that's never encountered such destructive power as displayed here and now by the British schoolboy, with your hosts Matt Needer
and John West. Tonight, Stephen goes Greek while manhandling his Machaira, and an equine extra gives Doctor Who's most wooden performance. Cast and crew make a drachma out of a crisis in 1965 historical The Mythmakers.
A Whispered Name, A Life Not Lived, and the biggest role for Chicken Bones in the show's 55-year run. An ensemble cast of much-loved characters and River Song star in 10th Doctor doubleheader Silence in the Library and Forest of the Dead.
And aged schoolboys, geriatric geneticists, and a crow-headed foe make life tough for the Fifth Doctor. Grateful that Philip Morris is yet to uncover the John Nathan Turner directed biscuit game scene, we review 1983's Mordrin Undead.
Hello!
Hi.
And we're back.
34.
Episode 34, yes. It's been so long since we recorded the last one that there was some debate on the way over here as to which episode we got to.
I was convinced it was 33, but I was wrong.
If you like, this is the very first episode of I'll Explain Later 2.0.
Yeah.
If we're going to go all web-friendly, I won't stick to that, I don't think.
Please don't, no.
We've been away for a few months. In the meantime, John has had a child.
Yes.
Congratulations, John.
Thank you.
All went off with no issues.
Yeah, and she's doing well. The bladder and guts are working well.
Excellent. Speaking of which, we've watched 3 episodes of Doctor Who. Going forward, obviously, at the end of the last episode, some months ago, we said a very fond farewell to our erstwhile colleague, Mr. Jim Hall, who, we presume is out there listening to this right now. Hello, Jim, if you're out there.
Hi, Jim.
Otherwise, for us, it's more or less business as usual. We're recording this episode.
Actually, under the terms of the court order, are we allowed to say hi to Jim, even via podcast?
I'm sure we'll be hearing from his solicitors shortly. We haven't made any major changes to the format, much as we considered it. We briefly considered becoming a true crime podcast, because that seems to be what the people want these days. But no, we are back in the room. We are talking about 3 episodes of Doctor Who. This month, it's just the 2 of us, but we might be joined by some very special guests in months to come. We've had some interesting conversations with people on that front.
Probably a lot more interesting than the conversation we're about
to have on mic. Absolutely.
So yeah, a bit of a shake-up this time round. But if you have any suggestions about how we should proceed in the coming months, keep them to yourselves.
Damn it, you beat me to that punchline.
Okay, let's kick off.
Let's set sail. So what are we looking at first this evening?
Well, first of all, we have The Mythmakers. William Hartnell, 1965, October through November of that year.
Yep.
And it's a fairly simple plot to describe because it's basically, part of at least the Iliad. So, it's the Siege of Troy and Agamemnon and Helen and Paris and all the rest. Actually, Helen doesn't feature, does she?
No, she's mentioned in passing, sort of quite amusingly.
We'll come back to that.
It's sort of a running joke how everyone's quite glad to see the back of her.
Yeah, which is really a hoot until the massacre at the end of it. But again, I'm probably jumping ahead.
Not to preview our major line of criticism on this story.
But yeah, the plot is fairly simple. It's a straight historical. They end up caught. They're caught up in the siege of Troy and sort of trying to get back to the TARDIS, more or less. I fear I've preempted what I think of this. It's a bit of a muddle for me, but Matt, kick us off.
Well, yeah, to be honest, I never encountered this story before. My perceptions of it were slightly coloured by the fact that this is the first of 2 scripts written for the series by Donald Cotton, who also wrote The Gunfighters, which I don't think any of us were particularly impressed with a few years ago.
I hated it.
You hated it, yes. It was quite dull. And this kind of carries on in largely the same vein that I think it's writing...
That bad?
Well, hang on, let me get to my point. This is very much Doctor Who history as genre. I mean, it's rooting itself very much in all of the kind of Greek myth retellings of the Siege of Troy, in the way that the Gunfighters was sort of setting itself in the Western genre. So it's sort of almost metafiction. It's fiction about fiction, really, is what we're looking at here. I have to say that I really enjoyed this, and I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I was going to. It's really it's a comedy, at least for the first 3 episodes, and the comedy is really funny. It's full of really good zinger gags, like genuinely funny jokes, which I think,
characterizations
and characterization, which I think the cast do a really good job with.
Yeah.
So you've got Barry Ingham, who is also, the character actor of the day, is also in one of the Peter Cushing Dalek films as Paris, who is absolutely terrific.
Yeah, the total standout.
Absolute standout performance. I mean, he gets all the funniest lines and playing this sort of vain, very, very sort of up himself, conceited character. But who's also weak and a total wimp. His relationship with his sister Cassandra, who is the augury, is that the right term?
Augur. Yeah.
She's kind of like the
Oracle.
The Oracle, that's it. His relationship with his sister Cassandra, who's the Oracle, is really funny because she's all sort of blood and thunder about everything all the time, and he's just sort of a bit kind of calm down, love. And there's a great bit where they meet Vicky and she claims to have knowledge of the future, and
she doesn't like that, does she?
No, and so Cassandra takes that very badly and says, "How can you have knowledge of the future?" And Paris goes, "Well, you're going on about the future all the time with your entrails."
Oh yeah, and he has a go at her galloping religion mania at one point as well. He sort of really lays into her every time about her superstitions and that. It's a load of old codswallop. Although annoyingly, of course, she's proved right
yes,
at the end.
Absolutely. And it's sort of the thing I like about it, which sort of sets it apart from a lot of the other sort of some of the later 60s historicals, I think, is that it's done in that quite, for want of a better phrase, he didn't invent the technique, but that quite sort of Russell T Davies way of like having the characters just speak like normal people, as opposed to everything being in a sort of cod Shakespearean tone. And it's just full of really funny exchanges. So the bit where, at the beginning, where the Doctor leaves the TARDIS and is immediately mistaken for the god Zeus, and he arrives during the altercation between, I forget what, is it Achilles and Hector? Yeah. And Achilles runs Hector through, and the Doctor says, "You killed him," and Achilles goes, "Yeah, but in your name."
Yeah.
It's full of really good jokes like that. It's the standard plot, I think, that the series kind of settles into. That it's about accidentally ending up in a historic skirmish or historic event, and the dramatic emphasis is simply getting out of it rather than resolving it. But I think there's a couple of things that are really interesting about it. One is that it does massively turn on a sixpence in the final episode. It becomes dark as hell. Half the characters kill half the other half of the characters, and it ends with a massacre and is incredibly downbeat.
Yeah,
in a way that certainly this series of Doctor Who feels incredibly downbeat. This is sort of quite interestingly situated, this, because it comes after Mission to the Unknown, which is a one-off Doctorless episode, which ends with the Daleks massacring all the heroes and being triumphant. And then the Daleks' master plan, which follows, has its lighter moments, but is another incredibly downbeat bloodbath, and then is followed by The Massacre, which we looked at a couple of months ago, which again is incredibly downbeat. So they're really putting the characters through the ringer at this point. So it's incredibly grim at the end. And even the cliffhanger, actually, where it's sort of weirdly intense that, Vicky is supposedly dispatched with a happy ending. She goes off with Troilus, and they're on the way to find Aeneas and presumably found Rome. Is that the myth that follows from there?
Sure,
why not? Showing the limits of our classical education here. But in the meantime, you've got Stephen mortally wounded in the TARDIS, the Doctor incredibly concerned for his safety, and this slave girl, Katerina, who is at this point convinced that she's died, and the Doctor's there to ferry her to the afterlife. So it's incredibly strange, dark ending. But the other thing that I think, and this might be something you have some sort of views on, is that in a way that all of the Hartnell historicals that we've considered so far, they're all about doing very different things with history. They're trying to find a pattern and a level for what the show can do in a historic setting. This alights on a couple of things. It starts off as the kind of history as genre kind of approach, but in a way ends up going to some sort of weird and, for want of a better phrase, timey-wimey kind of places. In that at the beginning you have the Doctor who considers the Horse of Troy to be just a myth. And then in an act of desperation, because he can't build a flying machine for Odysseus, ends up building the Troy the horse from memory, and then ends up creating that myth, and then Vicky becoming Cressida, of another myth as well. And in the sense that the title, which seems fairly bland and anodyne, the myth makers, the TARDIS crew themselves do become the myth makers. They become the authors of myth, and in a way,
all right, Professor Leavis.
Yeah.
I mean, I think let's not go too far here. I agree with most of what you're saying. I think I do so with less appreciation for the final sort of output.
So I got the hint that you weren't feeling this one.
I won't lie. I dozed off a little bit during episode 4.
Right.
Quite literally.
And we both enjoyed this in the audio version with
yes.
With minimal narration from Peter Purves.
That's right. And it's worth perhaps pointing out to anyone who hasn't seen it or heard about it or knows about it that this doesn't exist as a sort of full televisual experience, or indeed partial televisual experience. There's pretty much audio and snaps only. I do agree with you that those things are all in play, and the comedy is very good. The characters are deliberately broadly drawn, and they're very funny as a result. You mentioned, of course, Paris, who's extremely funny. The duel between Paris and Stephen is hilarious.
Oh, it's great,
it's
yeah.
Really, really good knockabout romp stuff. And the thing is largely a romp, but I just feel that instead of the comedy somehow making the turn to tragedy more poignant, it just makes it very jarring and weird, because it essentially has the same kind of feel as something like The Romans.
Yeah.
Which is very playful.
Well, episodes 1 to 3 are The Romans, and episode 4 is The Massacre.
That's it.
Which is like
and
cut and shut.
And also, it doesn't sit well with... I don't want to overdo it, because I don't want to sound like I've got a sort of Ian Levine-esque kind of addiction to continuity. But when the Doctor, certainly the first Doctor, has pretty developed views on not getting involved in established history. And suddenly, although it's all played for laughs, he's consulting for someone who wants to commit a massacre, and does commit a massacre.
Yes.
And facilitating a massacre. With a view to knowing that, usually when the Doctor goes along with some bad guy, he's got some special switch. That
I was going to say, that is sort of relatively uninterrogated by... I don't know whether it's just that they thought that the opportunity to have the Doctor create the Trojan horse idea seemed like a good wheeze. But,
yeah.
Even if in the Doctor's head it's only a myth until he makes it a reality, it's only going one way, and it plays out. He is the enabler of that massacre as well.
Yeah, and he does it with all the sort of winsome chuckles and and the bit of business with the potential for doing flying machines and him copping out because the test pilot was going to be him.
Yeah.
That's all very funny, but it just sits really ill with both the established continuity that he doesn't like much intervening in historical events, and also that it turns into a bloody massacre. And so he's really facilitating murder. That's not even reflected upon. It's not even there's not even a beat that's hit around that. And it just, for me, the material doesn't therefore quite gel.
No,
because it's more of a cut and shut for me than some of the other historicals we've seen. That said, I do think that Donald Cotton's writing for this is a lot punchier and funnier than in The Gunfighters.
Well, I think it's the gags that carry it over the line, really. The fact that he's able to fill it with zinger lines, which, as far as I recall, The Gunfighters really doesn't have. It's just more sort of pastiching the genre without really having anything to say about it. That is interesting. Yes, it is. It's immensely jarring, and I don't know. I was quite impressed by the boldness of how it switches up into tragedy in the last episode, in really sort of taking you down the garden path. But you're right. I think that the Doctor's complicit. The Doctor's completely complicit in the massacre of an entire city.
Oh yeah,
which is a sort of tough thing to bear. But then, again, putting it in the context of this,
and Cassandra, who's been the butt of jokes and then is proved right, is basically dragged off to be a... it's pretty heavily suggested she's dragged off to be a sex slave. It's just, it's a bit horrible. It's a bit nasty.
A bit much.
As I say, contrast that with episode 1, where Menelaus is discussing, I think, with Agamemnon about the 10-year siege and how it's all a bit of a drag.
Yeah.
And, sort of, this is your honour, your family's honour, about Helen having been taken away. And he said, I was actually quite glad to see the back of her. I mean, it's really funny.
I mean, yeah, that stuff all really zings. I mean, it's sort of hard to get my head around, really. But then I do look at it. I mean, this is the first full story that was produced by John Wiles, the relatively short-lived producer who took over from Verity Lambert.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it seems like his intention is to make Doctor Who pretty dark. At this point, I really like the TARDIS crew in this. I think Stephen and Vicky. I mean, Vicky sort of helps. I mean, she's your usual sort of slightly underdeveloped female companion, but yeah, I think again, what gets it over the line is Maureen O'Brien's performance, which I think is really good. In that, given that she has a sort of hastily written off romance, I do actually think that the chemistry between her and Troilus is sort of there in the performances, if not necessarily in the writing. So I think she's very good.
Yeah, James Lynn is a real romantic lead. I don't know where you're getting this chemistry from. I
don't know.
Maybe
it's more from her. Maybe it's more from her.
Maybe it's sizzled on celluloid, but it certainly doesn't come through on the audio for me. But then I think that's partly to do with the fact that we never really... Because Vicky is introduced in The Rescue.
Yes,
right?
a year earlier.
Have we seen much of her episodes since? But yeah, she's in Time Meddler and The Romans. I don't feel she ever really is drawn, and I think giving her a romantic send-off, I think you'd need to be invested somehow in the character for this to land, and I just don't think she's 1965's answer to Clara, if you ask me. She's kind of just there. The romance is... It's not quite as bad as Perry and King Yrcanos in Trial of a Time Lord.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I still think in the grand scheme, I mean, there's not been a huge number of very good romance send-offs for Doctor Who companions. I mean, and obviously, I feel like Jo Grant is probably the archetype of where at least they had 6 episodes to build that relationship before she leaves at the end.
That's the only one that I can think of off the top of my head that works.
That actually feels plausible.
Yeah.
And then there's Leela with a sort of random time.
Not least because it's in her own time as well. So.
Yes. I was thinking of Stephen and thinking how, at the end of the...
Oh, I love Stephen.
At the end of the massacre, 2 stories later, although quite a long chunk of time, because obviously you've got the Daleks master plan. The fact that all of the characters get really put through the ringer over this run of stories, and there's that fantastic scene at the end of the massacre where Stephen is berating the Doctor, essentially, for his irresponsibility of continually putting them in these... in these situations as an academic exercise. He says, what's the cost of your investigations? I feel that that's an interesting thread that does sort of start in this story. It's and especially coming off the back of a story, a one-parter 1 week earlier where the Daleks again massacre everyone and are seemingly victorious. It's I'm not sure if it's particularly fruitful route for Doctor Who to go down long term, but there is definitely a sense that like all bets are off and anything could happen. And even in this sort of light comedic historical sort of frame that we've seen before, the fact that it can switch up into this incredibly sort of punishing tragedy at the end of it.
Yeah.
I certainly feel whether or not it is in the script editing and the production, or whether it's just something that Peter Purves is bringing to the table. The ringer that Stephen's character goes through in order to get to the point where he's absolutely livid with the Doctor's sort of irresponsibility feels like a very new, serious thing to be doing. But as we always say, there's nothing new under the sun. There it was in 1965.
So I don't think you're sort of over reading that to see it there. I just don't think it quite sits appropriately with the material. It for me, it's more to do with the tone that this doesn't quite settle. Because the comedy is so broad, and then it takes such a sort of dark turn. You need to kind of see that that's where it's going a bit better into the earlier episodes or something. It just doesn't have that dramatic rhythm for me that could make it satisfying.
At the order of Ulysses, the Greek soldiers set to work cutting down huge trees, making the wood into planks. From the towers of Troy, the Trojan soldiers watched a big building grow taller and taller day by day, until it was 6 stories high. And when the Greeks pulled away all the work ladders and scaffolds, there stood a huge wooden horse, 80 feet tall.
Okay, so for our second story tonight, a story that I've just realised was broadcast just over 10 years ago, which is now starting to make me feel incredibly old, or that time is slipping away between our fingers.
You look incredibly old.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I probably look slightly better than I did in 2008. But anyway, that's a separate discussion. This is Silence in the Library and Forest of the Dead, which was broadcast May to June 2008. It's in the 4th series of New Who, and stars David Tennant as the Doctor, Catherine Tate as Donna. Always lovely to see that pairing, one of my favourites. And in this story, the Doctor is summoned by a mysterious message on his psychic paper to a library, which is essentially...
the library!
The library, yeah! Books! Oh, God. I thought we couldn't even get the intro without starting to prejudice this one. The Doctor's summoned to the library by a message on his psychic paper. This is a library that has every book in existence. It's like a sort of universal intergalactic version of the British Library, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Is the idea. And when they got there, they realised that there is nobody in the library. All the people that were supposed to be there teaming around are missing. As part of their investigations, they team up with an archaeological crew led by an enigmatic female archaeologist who seems to know a lot about the Doctor, called Professor River Song, played by Alex Kingston. This is interesting for all sorts of reasons. I mean, this is, I think, inarguably one of the most consequential episodes of Doctor Who from this period of the series, in that it does very much set up so many of the sort of ongoing concerns that would come back during the Matt Smith era, and then even through into the Peter Capaldi era. So it's an important episode. We've turned our noses up at a lot of Stephen Moffat stuff in the past.
Yeah.
We have probably nailed our colours to the wall as being at best sceptical about River Song. So I'm going to ask you in a sec, John, what you thought of this 10 years on. But I am also going to say that and it suddenly came into my head last night, that I remember you texting me after the first episode of this went out and saying to me, "This is what I pay my licence fee for," was your succinct review. 10 years on, how do you feel now?
Well, sadly, you do also pay your licence fee for Cash in the Attic and various other things. So, I mean,
Well, that's what I pay for.
Look. The text remains factually correct.
Yeah.
I
swear, maybe I was over-interpreting it as praise at the time.
No, you weren't. And look, I don't think it's a broken record. I'm a broken record, really, in terms of saying that, you know, as you quite rightly said, this tees up Series 5, Series 6 particularly, and those are series that I dislike a lot, and I came to be very frustrated with Moffat's time as showrunner. Much more the Matt Smith era than the Capaldi era. I feel like he did something different, and that kind of restored my faith in him a little. You know, so often you look at some of these tee-up episodes, and we've said before, Jim said before, that it's irritating to watch them because you watch them through the prism of what they mean and what it will bring and the baggage that it will laden Doctor Who.
You know how tiresome it became.
Yeah. And watching this, I didn't have that at all. Despite knowing that it was taking the show in a direction that I didn't like, I didn't care because this is so perfectly executed.
Wow.
I just love this two-parter. Everything about it is fantastic. And I think the mystery that it introduces with... I mean, incidentally, I think David Tennant and Alex Kingston have a much better kind of on-screen chemistry or ability
so
to
weird
work
you
with
say
each
that.
other.
I buy them
Than Matt Smith.
as a sort of weird lost romantic pairing here than I do at any time in any of her appearances later. I mean, against Matt Smith or Peter Capaldi.
Yes.
I mean, they sort of sizzle here.
Yeah.
In an odd sort of, and he's. I mean, you do really get the sense he's totally on the back foot with her as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, I butted in there.
No.
I buy it here.
Yeah, me too. I mean, that's exactly what I was going to say, and I couldn't agree more. I do love the fact that there is no real subtext here. There's not really a message about anything. It's just a nice psychological thriller. Insofar as, you know, it starts with the girl and the psychiatrist and the nature of dreams and reality and so on. That stuff is there.
Yeah.
But it's only there insofar as it helps create this thriller. And it's just an amazing piece of well-paced drama. There's lots of lovely imagery, the people in the spacesuits, the skulls falling to the front of the spacesuit helmet so that you can see that the person's died and being chased around. The fact that someone's soul is held, or their neural pathways or whatever are held temporarily in their communicators so they can speak from the dead. The things hidden in the shadows, such a Moffat-y thing. You know, the statues are alive, the shadows are alive. You know, for me, it's a bit like, in the same way that some people complain about Deadly Assassin because it introduces all of the Time Lord guff
Yeah.
that will become so boring even later in the 70s, but certainly in the 80s. People, I think, could rightly look at this and say, well, this sows the seeds of an era that a lot of people loved,
Yeah.
but that a lot of people didn't like. I didn't like it, but I don't, in the same way as I don't blame Deadly Assassin for the later errors.
For Arc of Infinity.
Yeah, exactly, for the later errors.
You don't blame this for A Good Man Goes to War.
No. And I do feel that if we're going to go down that route of saying, well, why does it then become unpicked? It's to do with the fact that Moffat seems to be of the view that the show's mythology is in and of itself interesting.
Yeah.
And that answering some of these riddles, or providing riddles on riddles, or solving a mystery by layering on more questions of, curiosity, and I'm fundamentally not interested in that. It becomes an inverted pyramid of mystery and questions. Yeah. There's something about this that is just enigmatic enough, just mysterious enough. In a way, it would have been better if we'd never seen River Song ever again, and this would always be in the Doctor's future at some point. I just love this. I think it's very well paced. It's a beautiful piece of horror. The sort of Matrix-like world of the saved souls in the computer is nicely disturbing. The scene where you see that all of the children are exactly the same.
Yeah, that's great.
Is really terrifying. The bit where Donna, who is, in her world, she is mother to these two children, when she's frantically looking through the duvet covers to find them, and they've disappeared because she's on some level realised they're not real. It's really harrowing, and she really I remember thinking, was watching it just now, I felt, God, that's so dark.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even darker, I think, is the bit where one of the children actually says, "We're not real, are we? When you close your eyes, we won't be there anymore." And it's like, whoa, okay.
I know.
Yeah. There's some heavy stuff.
But I just love this. And as you quite rightly said, Tennant and Tate are so on fire. They're such a beautiful pair. I think it is the dream team.
The dream ticket,
the whole 55-year run of the show. I've got nothing bad to say about this.
Wow.
Apart from
the
characterization of Miss Evangelista. First of all,
Tallulah Riley,
yeah.
Married twice to Elon Musk.
Twice, right?
Yeah.
First time you'd think, anyway, but that's a separate conversation. First of all, very lazy to just name her after a supermodel.
Yes.
But secondly, she actually is pretty and dim.
Yes.
Even though they criticise the others for having a go at her, she is actually just characterised as pretty and dim. She actually is pretty and dim.
I mean, that's the thing. For all that, I think by this point in the series run, I was getting a bit tired of how Davis deploys the sort of archetypes that, I thought, she's pegged as the underdog that is ultimately going to prove to be better than all the other people, and it's like, we've seen that enough times. I think it's still worse for her to be just stupid cannon fodder, essentially. Yeah, that's it. Although, that said, then, I mean, making a point of her prettiness, I mean, that's a great reveal when she pulls off the veil in episode 2. And they've got that, I mean, you only see it, you only glimpse it, but there's a horrible video distortion effect on her face, which is...
They could have just got my mother-in-law in.
That was a line Stephen Moffat cut from the first draft.
Yeah, it's up his street, that kind of thing, actually.
But no, this is interesting, because I didn't like this back in 2008 for reasons that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And I think I like it more now, but I think I like it less than you like it. It's interesting. I mean, yeah, as I say, I think there's absolutely no point in damning it. I think partly because a lot of the stuff that it does set up that the series over eggs in the coming years is sort of quite zingy and interesting. I mean, like River Song is enigmatic here. It helps that she's not so overwritten in sort of phrases that are designed obviously to go on a t-shirt or a badge or a meme or something or a gif in future years. There's a bit of the sort of hello sweetie flirtishness, but she does play it sort of quite sincerely rather than just, being written to kind of just float above the material in a series of catchphrases.
That's right.
So I mean, that helps it a lot. And also, I think it's...
And she's not so cocksure. I think one of the things that irritates people later on is the fact that she's so...
sort of invulnerable.
Yeah. And here, the fact that... And by the way, this proves that Alex Kingston could have done it all along if it had been written this way. When he doesn't recognise her, she's really quite hurt by that.
Yeah.
And that sense of emotional vulnerability and her reliance on the relationship with the Doctor, that's interesting. You don't really see that later on so much in that way.
For me, where this both succeeds and what happens subsequently is that I think we're in sort of similar territory to the 11th Hour, which I think is a better episode than this. But it's that
no, it's not.
Oh, okay, fine.
Sorry.
Fair enough.
And I like the 11th Hour, but this is,
It sort of sets itself up and then leaves itself with, or the ongoing story leaves itself with nowhere to go. I mean, I always think the thing that's sort of consistently most disappointing about how Moffat returns to River Song later is that there's very little. There is actually no mystery about her. Everything that you automatically assume on every performance to be the case turns out to be the case.
Yeah.
So this kind of who is River Song? What is she to the Doctor? It's pretty heavily implied that she's a future romantic partner to the Doctor, and that they may get married at some point, and that's exactly what happens.
Yeah.
I mean, ditto the running storyline of series 6. I always think at every twist in terms of like who is this. There's only ever a list of suspects of one. So I remember feeling at the time that the idea that it was River Song, as going way off topic, but the idea that it was River Song in the spacesuit shooting the Doctor, and that was also who the regenerating child would turn out to be, and that child would turn out to be Amy and Rory's daughter. I sort of felt that there was going to be a dramatic switcheroo, that it would turn out to be someone else.
Yeah.
So it's the problem with the River Song story is that there is no mystery about it. Everything that's heavily implied in the early appearances turns out to be true, and there's absolutely no twist whatsoever. But again, that's kind of getting ahead of myself.
But I think the thing is, it's interesting you mentioned the Impossible Astronaut, because I think something that Moffat is very guilty of is just heavily recycling his own. So he's basically got 4 or 5 ideas.
Well, all the tricks are here.
And yeah.
All of the tricks are here.
And here, I mean, okay, he has written for the series before up to now, but this feels like the first iteration of his idea of Doctor Who. So obviously the Empty Child and the Doctor Dances very much got his fingerprints on it. Blink, I think, is perhaps the kind of gateway drug to his version of Doctor Who. But this is the first time he really puts his stamp on it. Very clearly, I think very clearly with... Everybody knew at this point where it was going, and et cetera, et cetera. The fact that it's his first time doing that, really, I think it does feel very fresh. It's when he constantly recycles. So when you get to the Impossible Astronaut and there's some creepy shit with somebody in a spacesuit, well, we've seen that. The silence as a kind of alien species. I mean, he's written something called Silence in the Library, where the silence / darkness is creepy and having to look over your shoulder. It's that constant recycling of things.
Sort of sensory, don't look, don't breathe, don't listen, stay out the shadows, don't get up, don't sit down, don't leave the toilet unlocked.
Yeah, exactly. Or the seat up.
Yeah, exactly.
Or down.
Saved ourselves that.
Yeah.
I mean that's the thing. I think.
But here, all of this stuff feels very fresh.
Yes.
And he isn't recycling all of those ideas with added layers of mystery around the mythology of the show that aren't actually interesting.
Although, I mean, this is the second... I mean, it's 4 stories. I mean, the other thing that just made me... Because I actually couldn't remember what the resolution of this was until I rewatched it last night. And in terms of what happened to the people, it's another well-meaning computer AI fuck-up.
Yeah, which we just had in the Christmas special as well.
Well, I mean, which I think about 50% of the sort of post-2010 stories resolved of like, it's a computer that got it wrong. And which...
Well, it didn't get it wrong, did it, either? I mean, it did the right thing, didn't it?
Which is also... But it's also the resolution to The Empty Child, The Doctor Dances, if you recall as well, that it's a well-meaning computer AI fuck-up. Which means that, two stories out of the 4 he's contributed so far essentially have the same ending. But I'm being snarky. I think that this, to me, encapsulates both his strengths and weaknesses as a writer, this story. I think it's full of astonishing images and great bits, and to me, it doesn't really hang together. And, I mean, my major reservation with it is that I sort of think the Vashta Narada idea is a bit bullshit. And I think, bar some sort of looming out of the shadows kind of shock moments, I don't think he's ever I think in terms of that sort of sensory villain thing that he comes back to again and again, he does it better in Blink. I think he does it better elsewhere. So to me, it sort of falls on this thing that I don't I don't really buy the idea that shadows are dangerous piranhas. To me, that seems quite underbaked. But there were lots of, astonishing bits.
But then when the person has two shadows, that is really creepy. Don't you think?
Yes, I suppose, but
and all those long conversations with people when you know they're going to die.
Yeah,
it sort of ups the stakes with what are admittedly just a few stock characters.
But to me, it's the wrong way around. I mean, it's like I remember feeling. I think it's really deflating that when almost immediately, about halfway through the first episode, the Doctor says they're not shadows, they're Vashta Nerada, which is this thing that obviously he's known about, that like basically all shadows everywhere in the universe are dangerous, but he's only seen fit.
Oh, Vashta Nerada!
He's only seen fit to mention it now for the first time in his 10th incarnation, even though this is something he seems to have always known about.
Oh, come on, mate.
No,
you could say that for any villain.
I know, I'm being a dick. But for me, then it's just like, oh, okay, we're doing things with shadows, and then it's like, I've got two shadows. For me, the two shadows moment would have been far more creepy if it was a total unknown as to sort of what's going on, and it had become before it's the Vashta Nerada kind of moment.
Yeah, I don't think you need. I agree with you. You wouldn't have needed to name it, or to, Midnight is the next episode, and that's a disembodied threat where we never really work out what it is.
Yes,
and that's a lot creepier. And it would have done nothing to the narrative structure of this to have something similar, and it would have been a bit creepier. But I think you're really nitpicking here, mate. I think you're really nitpicking. I mean, think about how good that cliffhanger is. When Donna has been uploaded into that weird fleshy computer, and you've got the she's keeps repeating Donna Noble has been saved, and
Dave is going, hey, who turned out the lights?
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing.
Yeah, I don't know.
Even Murray Gold's brought his A game at that point.
No, Murray Gold's great in this, by the way. The music is terrific.
No, these wonderful bass-like pulses. Dum, dum, dum,
yeah.
Dum. It's really good.
There's a few bits where I think he's about to break out into our old friend Stock Music Space Adventure bit, where there's some sort of big timpani stuff going on. I don't know.
How can you not love this? This is absolutely top draw.
I don't dislike it. I guess I slightly think it doesn't need to be two parts. I think because for me the central idea of the Vashta Nerada, that the shadows are dangerous, for whatever reason, and this isn't just me saying that it's a very Moffat-y thing. You're right that I think all the tropes feel well. I think none of us had spotted the tropes by this point, and we have to view it through that lens.
Yeah.
For me, the fact that the Vashta Nerada threat, I don't really find that much cop, means that it's all kind of anchored around just a premise that I don't buy as such. And so I think it's a concoction of good bits, but I feel there's like a lot of manoeuvring around to get between all of these good bits and ideas. And this plays to Moffat's strengths and weaknesses as a writer in my mind. What remains the case, I think, throughout the Matt Smith era is that his grasp of an image or just a thing that he'll put on the telly is amazing, and I think he does consistently do that later. And I think that the problem is that the narrative flaws in his work become more and more pronounced, and you do realise he's just recycling tricks. But I think it's a series of astonishing images and great moments, like the Miss Evangelista's data ghost bit where she's slowly fading away and you see the battery fading and what she's saying becomes more and more incoherent. Now, that's an astonishing moment, and it's one of the harshest deaths I think I can recall in Doctor Who for a long, that I've certainly seen for a long time.
And of course the beautifully double ice cream,
yes.
ice cream. Well, it could be ice cream or it could be
and I think again, it's something that he runs into the ground a lot, and it carries through into Sherlock as well. But his sort of interest in the inherent artificiality of the televised narrative medium. So the fact that Donna is aware. The scenes from Donna's life, if they played out without commentary in the second episode, would just seem like normal jump cuts. We don't need to see her giving the children dinner in order to know that the
hot milk and the cartoons.
Exactly, that's all implied. We sort of assume that happened. It's not jarring for us as an audience to see a jump cut to the kids in bed.
Yeah.
But then the suggestion that Donna's experiencing her life as edited TV, and in that way sort of acknowledging the fact, becoming aware that she's a fictional character in an edited narrative, this is bold stuff for Saturday night TV that's going up against Anton Deck.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one thing I will always give Moffat credit for, is that he's a phenomenally ambitious writer in terms of the kind of, for want of a better phrase, postmodernism.
But here he
wants to
plays
put on
with
the TV.
that. He plays with that toy box here and achieves it.
Well, it's the first time he's got the toys out in a way, and it's, you think, oh great, new toys.
You were talking about his narrative issues later on. I mean, the problem I think later on is that you were saying, I can't believe. I mean, you work in television, ridiculous. You were saying that he does interesting things and then maneuvers the plot to get between them. I mean, that's kind of his job. I mean, it's true. But what he does wrong later, for me, is that he will create these. He's got these images and he's got this idea of how to get from one place to another, but there won't actually be a good narrative reason for, or you end up with, well, why did the TARDIS blow up, or who were the Silents in the end, and are they the same people who were against him on the Christmas planet, or is that different people? Or he just doesn't explain it very well. He actually doesn't tie up the threads in a way that means it's actually, if you sit down and think about it for a second, explicable.
Yeah.
Whereas here, the bit where the psychiatrist is telling the kid the real world is a lie and your nightmares are real, actually coherently fits with the skeleton in the spacesuit running around.
Yes.
All of those things are actually coherently and explicably part of the same thing.
No, it does all fit together. No, I'm not yes, no, I completely agree with that.
So what's your problem? Mate, you're just wrong. Where I think he also goes wrong later on is that he seems to see these mysteries about the personality or the personal history of the Doctor. This endless exploration of that, it becomes for him a fetish. And actually, the constant exploration of it without providing any answers doesn't make it a satisfying mystery a la Poirot or Inspector Morse or Sherlock Holmes, even some kind of procedural where there's a mystery and the pleasure is in the unveiling of how that was put together. It's neither explained, nor is it left enigmatically. It's just the mystery is constantly poured over as a mystery.
Yes.
And it becomes a fetish to keep doing that.
Yeah.
And actually keep asking questions about it denudes it of any mystery, because what becomes evident is that he doesn't actually have an answer.
No.
Like, who is the Doctor? He refuses to answer it, but he keeps asking the question. And so it becomes boring.
Or in the case of River Song, that the answer is just the dull. It was always what you probably think.
She's a lover and his wife. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I agree that those things, but they don't happen here. Here, it's the first time that you're really doing that, and if it had been left as that, maybe that would have been more interesting.
Can we at least agree that the bit where the Doctor gets the Vashta Narada to retreat by saying, "You're in a library, look me up," is awful?
Well, yeah, that's really bad. But then the same could be said of the 11th hour, where he says, "I'm the Doctor, and look me, you'll know what I." Because what I dislike about Moffat doing that is it lends to this idea that the Doctor somehow is a kind of intergalactic celebrity.
Yes.
Which I just have a bit of a problem with, because he's always got, for me, the Doctor's got to be a kind of outside, sideways glance.
Rogue element, yeah.
Rogue element. The other thing is that the Vashta Narada actually has him over a barrel at that point.
Yeah.
Similarly, that big ice stalk thing in the 11th hour could just go flick and kill him.
Done.
Like, okay. If he's got 5, if it's like the end of if it's like Parting of the Ways, where he's got 50,000 cables together and he's got 2 in his hand and he could connect them and something might happen.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
All right.
But yeah, I agree with you. That's bollocks.
Yeah. I don't know.
It's a very cheap way to get to the...
I like this. I just don't love it. That's where I'm at.
I love it, and I'm right.
Never before in the history of motion pictures has there been a screen presence so commanding, so powerful, so deadly. He's Conan the Librarian.
Can you tell me where I can find a book on astronomy?
Don't you know the Dewey Decimal System?
Conan the Librarian.
Okay, and for our final story tonight, we're going back to February 1983, when by this point in the real world, my mum would have been 6 months pregnant with me. So obviously carries an immense personal significance to me, this story. Not sure really why I bothered to bring that up. But we're looking at Mordrin Undead, which is from the show's 20th season, the 20th anniversary season that legendarily brought back an element from the Doctor's past for every single story. And what happens in Mordrin Undead? This is something we were debating just immediately prior to hit and record. But in a nutshell, the Doctor and his companions Tegan and Nyssa are on board the TARDIS. They get stuck in something called a warpalypse, which, I assume is a time travel equivalent of just getting stuck in some mud or something.
Yeah.
And in order to escape it, they end up materialising on board a spaceship, which has on it a transmat capsule seemingly pre-programmed to land in a public school on Earth, and various time travel-related shenanigans ensue, which include the Doctor and his new friend Turlough being stuck in 1983 on Earth, and Tegan and Nyssa being stuck in 1977 on the same point, but 6 years earlier. There's various versions of the Brigadier knocking around, and the Black Guardian pops up every now and then to shout and has a giant bird on his head.
And there is Mordrin.
And there is Mordrin as well, who I'm sure we'll come to in the fullness of time. But I think it's not prejudicing anything that we're about to say. To say this is, by classic series standards, an incredibly dense set of 4 episodes. I mean, there is a lot going on here and a lot to pick apart. I do feel like I have some sort of connection with this story in that shortly after I got into Doctor Who, when I was 10, this was one of the first stories that I ever owned on VHS. I was given this for my 11th birthday by an aunt. So me and this story go back a long way. I haven't watched it very much in the last couple of decades, but I do feel like I know it very well. John, were you coming to this fresh?
It's funny because I remember very vividly the first episode.
Yeah.
And I have in my mind that I've got a really good memory for what I've watched and what I haven't watched. I've watched the first episode. I've never seen any of the rest of it.
Right.
So we must have at some point been round at your house, started watching it, and decided not to continue.
Not to persevere.
Which at least shows that I have a consistent take on.
Right. So in a nutshell, is this a thumbs down for you?
Yeah. I'm not a big fan of 80s Who.
No.
I will watch it more out of sort of a connection with that era. I grew up in the 80s a little. I mean, I was born in 83 as well, but I have a cultural folk memory, if you will, of that era, and I feel connected to it. I don't hate everything about Doctor Who in this era, but I just feel it's a lot of it bad television that obviously has aged badly, but just in and of itself, it's bad.
Wasn't
television.
that good in the first place?
This isn't the worst of that. I feel. In fact, there's a lot that's going on that's fairly promising.
Put that on the Blu-ray cover.
But it's not good. I don't think it can be defended as good.
Oh, okay. I like this.
Okay.
I really like this. I think it's interesting for a few reasons. I mean, first of all, it's weird to watch this and be thinking, did Stephen Moffat write this? I mean, it's extraordinary how much.
I mean, he didn't.
No, it's Peter Grimwade.
Peter Grimwade.
I found watching this on the same run as Silence in the Library, Forest of the Dead to be really interesting because, having thought a lot about what the Moffat box of tricks is, here you've got similar, for want of a better phrase, timey-wimey shenanigans. You've got the split time zone, multiple versions of one person potentially bumping into each other. There's a preoccupation with the mythology of Doctor Who, which the original series didn't do terribly often, I think, other than sort of the Doctor goes back to Gallifrey kind of episode. So, the fact that this is somehow based around regeneration, the fact that Mordrin, who is supposedly nominally the actual villain of this story, is a rogue scientist who tried to turn himself into a Time Lord by stealing and modifying a piece of equipment from Gallifrey that's sort of kept on hand in case a regeneration goes bad on Gallifrey, and him and his buddies end up in this sort of perpetual state of regeneration where they're constantly enduring the torment of regenerating but never actually dying. I mean, that's, I think, quite an interesting idea in and of itself, but it is one that does that very Moffat-y thing of sort of riffing on the mythology of the show and kind of shaking up having a having a grab bag of the tropes of Doctor Who in order to see what works. There's a lot in here that doesn't work. There's a lot.
There's a lot that doesn't.
There's
work.
a lot that doesn't.
There
hang
really
together.
is a lot that doesn't work.
For me, the thing that totally gets this over the line more than anything else is the Brigadier.
Yeah.
Now, the conventional wisdom about this, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the original plan was for it to be Ian, William Russell, coming back, hence the school setting, and he would be in that role. That, for whatever reason, didn't work out, and the conventional sort of fan take on it is that it doesn't really make much sense that the Brigadier is now teaching maths in a school, and it looks like they've sort of bussed in another character from Doctor Who of yore in order to sort of plug the sort of fan service, bring back a character gap. I completely disagree with this. I think what they do with the Brigadier in this story is fascinating and is a good deal more psychologically interesting than anything that they have anything really
that they ever do with him.
Well, that they
have
ever
done.
do with him, or that the classic Doctor Who ever really tries to do with a recurring character. It seems very out of step with the sort of fairly flat character development and the sort of bring it back for the fans sort of mentality of the 80s.
You get him because basically it is later explained that because they talk about him having had a nervous breakdown.
Yeah.
Which for a character as cocksure and 5 rounds rapid as the Brigadier is quite a shock. It's worrying, you're really worried about him, and he plays it very well. That's
the
being
thing.
Lost.
Courtney's performance here is, I'm not going to say, because, I love the unit era, so I'm not going to say this is the best performance he ever gives, but I'm going to say that he does knock it out of the park in this.
Yeah.
The very real sense that there's something wrong with this well-loved character and that he's not all there is beautifully handled. Even to the point where I made an initial note, and we made a joke about it in the intro to the show, and my initial thing is when the Brigadier says, in 30 years of soldiering, I've never encountered the destructive power that has just been exhibited by the Great British Schoolboy, when there's sort of fairly minor car collision that leads to a bit of concussion and a car being overturned. When you think, like, no, this is a guy, I'm calling bullshit. This is a guy who's seen, like, nuclear power stations get blown up by the Master.
Yeah.
That sort of stands out. But then later you sort of start to realise, oh no, something's gone wrong here. And there's something terribly moving, I think, about the shot where, he first meets the Doctor. And Davison actually plays this really well as well. And the Doctor does a sort of, he doesn't recognise me because I've regenerated, lol, kind of thing. And then the penny drops quite quickly for the Doctor that there's something wrong.
Yeah.
With him, that it goes a bit deeper than it just not recognising him. But there's a bit where they go into his little hut and the camera follows the Brigadier as he goes into that very squalid little kitchen that he's got in there and just grabs the kettle, and then they go and sit down. And then there's a cutaway shot of Brigadier in his sort of unit era prime sitting on top of the 2-bar fire or whatever it is. And it's very, very sad. And you feel like the script and the direction and performances do pull you into direction of feeling this is a very sad decline for a heroic character that is very well loved by the audience. And in some ways, this is given at least a bit of an explanation by how events pan out. In explaining that the events in 1977 have sort of contributed to a bit of amnesia for the Brigadier. But
it's more than that, isn't it?
It is more than that. It's kind of...
He's lost his way. He's lost his reason for... his raison d'être.
Exactly.
He's lost that.
Exactly. And there's something... And again, I'm cautious about reading too much into this, where this is there by design. But we do know, obviously, it's been quite well documented that Nicholas Courtney had some quite serious mental health problems that kind of plagued him throughout his life, essentially all the way through his career and into later life. And... I might be overreaching here, but I do feel that amazing scene where he's screaming at the Doctor, "I'm fit as a fiddle, I always have been." And then he says, "I'm sorry, Doctor, I had a bit of bother with overwork a few years back." And then he goes, "Breakdown, I don't know the meaning of the word, this one goes on till he drops." And it's like, it feels very real, very psychologically real, in a way that really marks it out from most other 80s Doctor Who, which feels... two-dimensional at best, to be honest. Paper-thin characters. I'm sure we'll get onto some of the other paper-thin characters who populate these 4 episodes. But for me, that almost lifts it above everything else. Now, I think there are also some technical things that this does very well. I think there's a lot going on in the plot a lot of it sort of comes to nothing, and it does sort of all hang on a walloping level of coincidence required to pull all these strings together. The Black Guardian is there, but also entirely peripheral to the narrative. Fine, I'll grant that it's the first of a trilogy, and he'll probably do something a bit further down the line. But he's just there to shout. Essentially, he kind of has no anchor in this at all.
No.
What I would say is that some of the pacing and editing of this, I think, is exemplary. The little sequences where you're almost kind of intercutting between Tegan and the 1970s Brigadier, working out what the situation is, and then the Doctor and the older Brigadier in 1983 sort of reaching the same conclusions as the Brigadier's searching through his memory for the experiences that we've just seen, is it's really elegant. It's really elegantly put together. The fact that some care is sort of given to demarcating these two eras, even though the sets are exactly the same, it's exactly the same place. I think this is very nicely put together in places.
Did like the schoolboys with their 1977 Jubilee,
Silver Jubilee.
But that's a clever
Tegan.
that's a clever little thing.
And it gives Tegan a lot of agency as well. Is when the mentions of the Silver Jubilee is what causes her to realise that she's not where she's meant to be at all.
Yeah.
I think it teases out its mysteries and its sort of central premise very, very well. And I think it barrels along, I think, certainly for the first few episodes, barrels along at such a pace with so many sort of, I think, quite good bits, some less good bits, but with some good bits, that you're sort of distracted from the fact that not a lot of it hangs together. Given that a lot of, well, to be honest, a lot of classic Doctor Who full stop is about kind of setting up a basic proposition in episode 1, running on the spot for episodes 2 and 3, and then wrapping it up with an explosion in episode 4. I think the fact that this sustains its pace of revelations and mysteries sort of pretty much right into the final furlong of episode 3 at least is quite impressive. I'm going to let you get a word in edgeways because I'm sure there are some bits that we want to rip apart. But what I will say is that, having said that Stephen Moffat is ambitious, I do think Peter Grimwade is being very ambitious here, and he's being a lot more ambitious than a lot of the other writers at this point, who will just do a thing of like, oh, what if the Cybermen were there or something. I think he's trying to do something clever, and I certainly think in terms of, I don't think it's just in Nicholas Courtney's performance. I think in terms of what he puts on the page, in terms of the Brigadier's story, I think works really, really well. So I'm kind of inclined to give this. No, it's not a masterpiece by any means. I certainly think I probably liked it a lot more than you. But I think in terms of what it's trying to achieve and what it does actually achieve and the elegance with how it does it, I think this is one of the more enjoyable and more successful 80s stories that I've come across in a long time.
Okay. Elegance isn't a term that I would associate with this at all.
Okay.
I do agree that Grimwade has played with some interesting ideas. I agree completely with the. I want to say I didn't hate this. I didn't hate it as much as other story. I mean, Terminus is the next serial.
Yeah,
that's
fucking
abominable.
Terrible. Yeah,
it's not in that sort of Kent Building Society Conference League of worst ever 80s Doctor Who, but it just suffers all of the problems that bedevil that era. I agree with the stuff with the Brigadier very much, that it's there, it's deliberately there, and certainly Nicholas Courtney brings something to that. And I agree that Grimwade is playing with interesting stuff. The search for immortality. Funnily enough, that pops up again in the Five Doctors. A lot of the imagery is quite similar to the Five Doctors. Sort of the effigies which represent real people held in stasis,
yes,
and the idea that actually the search for immortality is a hiding. It's actually a curse rather than something to be grateful for. The hubris of wanting to go for that shot for immortality is met by Nemesis in the case of their kind of putrefying and disgusting and never-ending lives. Even though those ideas are perfectly interesting or perfectly valid and worthy of exploration. And I don't know whether this is Grimwade, I don't know whether this is Eric Sayward as the script editor. It simply doesn't hang together as television. There is even a line that the Brigadier
You're
says.
brandishing the papers now, Your Honour.
There's even a line the Brigadier says where in episode 3 where he says, "That's the third time today I've yonked up that wretched hill." And as a viewer, it's like, could you not have done this so that they're not constantly walking
up and down a hill.
Up and down a hill.
Yes.
I mean, it's just, it's infuriating to watch.
I mean, that's a particular problem with this era as well, in that a lot of activity is generated from characters having to run back and forth between two points.
I wrote in my notes, lots of traipsing up that bloody hill.
Yeah.
And then he says...
It's a nice looking hill, though.
and
Very handsomely shot.
Handsomely shot, beautiful hill. That that obelisk is very pretty and everything. But it's like, there's doors that open, doors that close. There's two brigadiers that wander around. They must not meet, and then of course they do. People going from one, people just missing each other. It's like a French farce, but without the comedy.
Yeah.
And it's just so shonkily built. The performances, Mark Strickson is a limited actor, isn't he?
Well, this is the thing. Mark Strickson.
And also, what is this? What is this boarding school that seems to take boarders up to the age of 38? It's just... like when the poor chap who plays Hippo.
Oh my God!
He must be at least 30 in that. Right?
I was going to say his teenage children must have been mortified to see this go out.
Stephen Garlick.
Yes,
he was born in 1959, so allegedly he was only 24.
People did look a lot older in the past. I am always fascinated that I'm now older than Sean Connery was in Dr. No, for example.
God.
Which is just quite...
But
yes.
They clearly don't have any recent memory of what it was like to be at school.
No.
And, I just... Oh.
Can we talk about Strickson for a bit? Because I find this fascinating. As you say, a uniquely limited actor. He emotes like he's in a silent film. It's all sorts of fingers and eye popping and that kind of thing. In the scenes then,
in that sense, he's well cast against Valentine Dial.
That's the thing. When it's him and the Black Guardian in a two-hander scene, it's camper than a row of tents. It's like Dial standing there with a crow stuck to his head, seemingly dressed like sort of Pat Butcher in biker's leathers. And Valentine Dial, to be fair, he was sort of known as the Man in Black for a lot of his kind of radio roles. He was
the narrator for the long-running horror series on radio, wasn't he?
Right. Well, he's got that kind of voice, hasn't he?
You will obey me in all things.
You kind of cast him to do that voice. But he's just given one note to play with. And then, you've got Strickson sort of careening around him like a mime artist.
So peripheral is the Black Guardian.
But also, none of that element. And,
feel that they've...
I get that it's teasing that this is obviously a trilogy, and we're not going to find out for a couple of months exactly what's going on there. That's fine. But it's quite...
But it feels like it was
quite a burden on the narrative.
It feels like it was shonked onto to a script that, because if you take out the Black Guardian, everything else works. I don't mean works as in works.
Yeah.
But if he wasn't there, the story could go up and down the hill just as much.
It's a massive distraction, isn't it?
It feels like it has been bolted on by Saward and John Nathan Turner. It feels like there was a story that basically has all of its parts, and the Black Guardian has been... Now, whether that's actually true, I don't know, and to be honest, I don't care, but that's how it looks, to the extent that the Black Guardian's dialogue is so redolent of the leaden Saward thing of said no one ever. Like, no one speaks the way, or could...
It's incredibly contorted at the end as well. It said, "You'll be witness to the nemesis of the Doctor." Also, what's never adequately explained is why does the Black Guardian need a schoolboy to... Why does he...
Also, the fact that he actually is revealed to be the headmaster of the school, that is... All I wrote is that the headmaster cover is deep.
Yeah.
Deep cover.
Well, no, is he? Or is it just in that scene? Because to be honest, that's quite...
No, but...
That's quite a creepy moment, I will say.
But it's a strange scene anyway, because basically at that point, Turlough is... it's so bizarre, it doesn't work at all. it's so bizarre because Turlough at that point
I've
is
forgotten that they're so upfront about Turlough being an alien as well, which then they forget about for quite a long run of the series, where they treat him like a public schoolboy along for the ride, and then he gets in contact with his people again in his final episode.
But like the conversation with the headmaster is before it's revealed that it's actually the Black Guardian is so bizarre because basically Turlough is meant to have confessed to the headmaster, yeah, there's this creepy guy with a crow on his head.
So what happened, right? Work with me on this. But when we crashed,
yeah. I mean, try telling that story to the loss adjuster. But but he's like, no, so there's this creepy guy with a crow on his head who's telling me to kill this time traveller called the Doctor.
Yeah.
And if I don't, then he'll do unspecified harm to me. And the headmaster's like, right, so what are you going to do? And actually kind of discussing, well, you should go ahead with it then, shouldn't you? You had a bargain. It's like, at what point did Turlough not think, hang on, sorry, you're the headmaster of the school, you're telling me to go ahead with this murder?
It seems like, I mean, I know that public schools in the past were quite abusive places, but,
well, no, I mean,
but it has its limits.
I mean, that's the thing. I don't particularly like about the Brigadier's characterization. He seems desperately keen to have all the kids flogged every couple of seconds. There's one bit, I trust you flogged that man within an inch of his life. Of course, I thought it was interesting that it was, I trust you flogged that man within an inch of his life, given that they are all about 40.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no teenage boys to be found anywhere near that site.
But that's the other, there's a lot of kind of dangling stuff that, I mean, maybe it's just that we're not used to. I mean, like, there are certain aspects.
And this is before I even get to the spaghetti on Mordrin's head, or any of the kind of production issues, or the weird floaty ballet costumes that they give all of the, and the fact that they couldn't quite decide whether. There was clearly
no one's agreed on a walk.
So, they've clearly been given a direction on day one.
The script, I bet, is quite impressionistic. Of like they glide from one.
They glide, and so one of them appears to genuinely be on wheels, and then the rest of them are pretending they're doing that. They're doing that thing like trying to do a kind of steady cam walk where they're kind of staying. But no, but that's before I get to any of the design things or the lovingly crafted cruise ship stylings.
See, I quite liked the Art Deco spaceship.
Oh, no, 80s Art Deco.
80s Art Deco spaceship.
Yes.
It's better than a lot of the kind of sets you get. I mean,
anyone who's ever been on the Brittany Ferries ship from Portsmouth to St Malo will know exactly what it's like to be on a vessel with that kind of decor.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's very much the it's probably same era most of the fleet as to whoever was working on this.
So, but that's before, and so this is.
I think that's a better set than you often get in this era.
I agree, and I'm not. But I'm just saying that it still looks fabulously dated. I mean, it looks fabulous, but I'm not even talking about kind of like costumes or or the hilarious Tegan and Nyssa aging scene. With them writhing around without really much dramatic talent on show.
It's sort of, although
and lots of purple makeup.
Although Junior Nyssa, of course, played by Lucy Benjamin, who played Lisa in EastEnders a couple of decades later.
Wow. Yeah. That's the most interesting thing about Mordrin Undead. Why didn't you say... I mean, to the extent that...
could have invited her on to talk about this.
It just doesn't have that... There's just a lot of traipsing up that bloody hill. It's so shonky the way it gets from one place. Now, we were saying earlier about, Silence in the Library. You were saying, again, weirdly, I think, that, he does lots of interesting scenes and gets you from one to the other as if that was a problem. Here, there aren't really interesting scenes. There are interesting ideas, and the getting between them is interminable.
But
I don't see how you can.
But also, when I said at the top, like, did Stephen Moffat write this? I mean, in as much as weirdly Grimwade not only nails a lot of his preoccupations in terms of like playing with the tropes of the series, the time travel cleverness or something, but also a lot of the flaws. I mean, the fact that the aspects in which this is unsatisfying to me feel quite similar to why I find a lot of the Matt Smith era unsatisfying. which is one thing to say that's very different to why
No,
I
the only
find a lot
difference-
of the rest of the Davison era unsatisfying.
The only difference, that's true. This is bad in completely different reasons.
I mean, where this doesn't work, and
Moffat. The only thing that Moffat would have done differently is that he'd have put one of them in a bloody fez to really point out to the viewer, "Hey, this is crazy and really intelligent."
Yeah. Well, they'd have absolutely egged out that. I mean, they only do that shot the once where the two brigadiers pass each other because in the corridor.
Yeah.
And you assume that the 70s brigadier must have terrible eyesight, seeing as the 80s brigadier is probably about 10 feet away from him.
Right,
at that
exactly.
point. It's like, who's this man in the tweed jacket wandering around?
Although it is impressive as well, isn't it? How they managed to make the 70s brigadier look so much thinner than the 80s one.
Sort of weirdly older as well.
It's just, but like they do manage to make them look like it does look like 7 or 6 years have passed.
I mean, and Courtney plays I mean, again, maybe this would be a good place to round it.
Well, he's
bring it
more
back around to,
unravelled
but-
as the older.
Yeah, I mean, Courtney does a very good job of playing it twice, playing two different people, and
Yeah.
you do feel that there's been some thought that's gone into how he's going to play this.
Speaking of Moffats, I think Peter Moffat. For me, I suspect that Grim Wade delivered a script.
Yeah. I mean, we know for a fact that he did.
and it touched on interesting kind of things and interesting places. I suspect, though I don't know, I suspect that a lot of the reason I don't like this is to do with the polish it was given by Saward and the directorial
Direction from
choices.
Moffat.
But on the other hand, you see, so much of it is just pointlessly going from one place to another.
Yeah.
I think if you're
Which I think is the structural failing of this era of Doctor Who, in that it's about, like, generally stories just seem to be about, identifying 3 sets and cycling between them.
Yeah, and as I've pointed out before, I know Jim disagrees to a large extent, but as I've pointed out before, I simply don't believe that Peter Davison, especially this iteration of him with the huge sideburns, has ironically the chops, mutton or otherwise, to carry this.
Strong.
I just don't think he's not leading man material.
No, I mean,
well,
he's
certainly not then. I've seen him in other stuff subsequently, particularly the last sort of 10 years or so. I think he's a very good actor, but he just doesn't have any kind of... And he's just... There's one point where he just says, how could you have been so stupid to Tegan? In a really irritated way, about something that she couldn't possibly have known about. There's nothing to like about this character. It's almost like...
Well, there's nothing to like about any of them, really. I mean, this is the problem, that they're just continually people getting at each other. And that is very much a Saward trait, that he believes that sort of conflict equals drama.
Yeah.
Well,
he's created drama right here.
in his very facile way. His approach to that is just simply to have the characters yelling at each other constantly. To the point where, the Doctor sees nothing of inviting an incredibly shifty character who has fairly flagrantly been trying to kill him throughout the last 4 episodes, and think, well, one more person who hates me is not going to make much difference.
He just sort of rolls his eyes and extends his arm, doesn't he? But yeah, I think if you're going to have this level of traipsing from...
I think that's the thing, though. So it does show what a lack of premium he puts on his friendship with Tegan and Nyssa. That just this random shady bloke who's also...
Who they obviously don't
fine.
like.
Who no one likes. It's just like, fine.
But I think if you're going to pointlessly traipse from one place to another, it might be a bearable watch if it's not also alongside Paddy Kingsland's score.
Oh my God, the music is bad. I mean, there's nothing... I mean, the driving music at the beginning...
It's hilarious.
Which is like lifted from fucking Postman Pat or something, is dire. But there's not a single moment in it which is supposed to carry some sort of dramatic gravitas that isn't completely over-egged by the score. So, the 3 moments... And this is... I mean, sometimes... where the music and the direction and Strixon's sort of balletic performance really come together.
What?
Are the bit
balletic
where
performance?
I mean that as a critique.
Okay.
He's sort of roaming the stage like he's Kate Bush or something. But the bit where he tries to throw the crystal down and it's stuck to his hand.
Yeah.
And
yes, I forgot about that.
and he goes 3 times, and the music goes ew, ew, ew,
But
and
slightly out.
Yeah, and the camera also does a gentle push in 3 times. It's like, fuck me, someone thought they were getting a BAFTA for this.
But the timing of all of those things, which presumably could have been sorted in the edit,
slip the music
is
track.
Acorn Antiques-esque.
Yeah. That's I mean, that's really bad, that bit. I know the music is
Unforgivable.
tone deaf, I think.
Yeah.
Weirdly, it's like it's very, very bad.
Like much of the script.
I mean, essentially, you mentioned Peter Moffat directing. I mean, he gets a really bad rap from fans these days, and I think it's because he's quite open about the fact on documentaries as well. I mean, he's this sort of and now this kind of sort of elder. I can't remember if he's still with us actually, but he's sort of elderly ham. Sort of Thesby type. In all the DVD extras, he's consistently, I never had an idea what was going on in any of the scripts, and any time anyone tried to explain it to me, I'd just glaze over. And I definitely think he's incapable of directing in a way that's sympathetic to the material. I would also say, I mean, I do think get him out on location, he can.
To the material.
Well, it's just.
I mean, you're asking a lot of the director there, aren't you?
Well, but at no point do you feel that anything here has been enhanced by his presence. But
I don't believe any of that stuff has happened, basically. Every time you're watching it, it's just...
But then we do come back to the bit that, and then maybe it is just in the script or how it came together in the edit. But I do think there are bits of this that are quite elegant.
Elegant?
Yeah.
I can't just... all I can do to cap my view, and I'm not going to say a thing more about this.
Right.
I'm going to quote Mordrin. Spare me the agonies of perpetuity.
Well, luckily, this is only 100 minutes.
Thank Christ.
The new boys spend their first few terms in Social Hall, more commonly called the horse boxes. There's no personal fagging now, just general cleaning and charring.
It's fags. Every 2 weeks, you'll have a fagging duty which will be put up on the board. And you'll either have to sweep, this is called little end, or the other end, which is big end. You have to sweep one of them, or go and wash out one of the bars.
John, is it a good feeling being back in the saddle?
It is. I feel good. I feel glad that we've come back. I think we should probably do another one.
You fancy doing another one at some point?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will be back next month. But in the meantime, the mail sack has run dry. The mail sack's run dry?
It bulgeth not.
It's hanging limply over the back of a chair. So do write to us. Obviously, you've only heard two perspectives on this episode. I feel like we did disagree on most things, which is always good for a podcast. But do write to us with your views on any of the stories that we've reviewed today. We would love to read out some letters or feedback. And if you want to get in touch with us, John, they can tweet you, can't they? Because you run our Twitter account. What can they tweet you on?
Sporadically, I will be contactable at @explainlaterpod.
At @explainlaterpod, depending on how.
And it has been really, really heartwarming to see so many people get in touch and say, when are you coming back? When are you doing your record? So do keep those messages coming. They're very galvanising for us.
Yes. When you dragged yourself up and watched. Oh, so this will have been your daughter's first experience of watching Doctor Who, I'm presuming.
Yeah, she watched Mordrin Undead with me.
Yeah, and immediately rang the NSPCC.
yeah. Ranson's on my case.
Yeah, fair enough. So you can tweet us at explainlaterpod, email us to hello@illexplainlater.com. We do have a Facebook page. We should probably figure out how, because Jim used to run that, so we should probably figure out how we run that. But we are on facebook.com/I'llExplainLater. We will be back next month, but I hope you've enjoyed the show, and we will see you very soon.
Till then, bye.
Bye.